In the most westerly part of France, Brittany covers a peninsula that is also the westernmost limit of Europe. The north of Brittany is the final landmass marking the junction between the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. Along the Brittany coastline, the land confronts the sea in many different ways. Here, there are kilometers of beaches. There, hostile rocks rise vertically to defy the waters. Rock formations along the Brittany coast are among the oldest and the hardest on the planet. Nevertheless, they have given way in many places, sometimes to form islands and sometimes gulfs. Water is an ever-present element in the North Brittany landscape. Watercourses meet no obstacle in a land almost devoid of hills. For a long time, they were the only frontiers in an area which systematically leads to the sea. North Brittany has been inhabited for thousands of years, as demonstrated by the famous standing stones, witnesses of prehistoric times. Various civilizations have left durable markers in the unusual heritage of Brittany, in which the sea is constantly at the forefront. The sea became a source of wealth, which led to the rise of many formidable pirates. Ever since the beginnings of sail power, Breton boats and fishermen have laid the foundations of a living culture and a dynamic economy. The Breton people, totally oriented seawards, had to protect their property from envious eyes, but they never turned in upon themselves. Singing and music are an especially strong part of the Breton identity. Bretons keep up a lively popular tradition while maintaining an interest in external influences. All down the generations, rhythms and sounds have survived in communal life, in which the Catholic religion is often present. The many riches of the sea and some culinary specialities have become emblematic of Breton savoir-faire. The local color can appear monochrome, but in fact is very varied. Different types of rocks, such as sandstone and schist, have been used in building both modest houses and sumptuous residences. But when stone became too expensive, buildings had to make do with a wooden structure, which was both flexible and sturdy. In today's towns, the same colors are predominant. The design is simpler, but the same materials are used as those of the wayside crosses of the Middle Ages. As in a book, medieval faith presents itself in images and also takes much more elaborate forms in historical religious treasures. Without its rock, Brittany would not exist, for it provides its contours and its personality. It also feeds the inspiration of artists. Ideas and times have changed. Raw materials and creative methods have evolved, but the Breton soul has remained unchanged through the ages. The road network gives Brittany rapid access to and from the rest of the country. The flat landscape makes for easy communication by road, and the many elegant highway structures mean that valleys don't have to be circumnavigated. The port and road infrastructures are keys to Brittany's success. The region has no fewer than 13 commercial ports. Natural resources are plentiful, starting with granite, a very hard rock that has been exploited for thousands of years. Wind energy is inescapable. It supplies more than half Brittany's needs in electricity. In Brittany, a large part of industrial activity concerns the food sector. An essential sector because a third of businesses and a third of industrial jobs are found here. Brittany is the foremost region of France for agricultural production. Several specialities, such as potato cultivation dating back to the 17th century, have helped make its reputation. The bud of the artichoke plant, a sort of edible thistle, is served at table and is as famous in Brittany as the cauliflower. 75% of French cauliflowers come from here. Brittany is the leading French region for animal production. The soil is right for forage and the climate is perfectly well adapted to rearing animals. The hair of some animals is used for making traditional paintbrushes, which have earned an international reputation. Caramel forms a noteworthy association with butter, a butter which in Brittany has always been salted. Salted butter caramel has become a jewel of local cuisine. 40 or so golf courses, often laid out amid glorious scenery, cater for enthusiasts. Sailing and its spin-off activities are naturally very successful in Brittany. The coastline, appreciated both from the sea and from land, still retains long, unspoilt stretches. Britons have built up here a wealth of traditions. The department of Ille-et-Vilaine in the east of Brittany is one of 4 in the region, named after the river Vilaine and the river Ille, which runs into it. At the confluence of the 2 rivers sits the town of Rennes, the county town. Rennes is the most populous of Brittany's towns with over 200,000 inhabitants. It's also one of the historic capitals of Brittany. It grew in the valley of the Vilaine River on land that was at one time a marsh. Through one of the medieval gates, you enter the old town, sitting astride its promontory. The wooden-framed houses are typical of the Middle Ages, but thanks to the abundance of wood in the region, this building technique continued long after medieval times. Unfortunately, 1,000 similar houses were destroyed in a fire at the beginning of the 18th century. The surviving ones demonstrate the good taste of their owners. Stone being an expensive commodity, only the ground floor was stone-built. The modest cost of wood-framed houses was their principal attraction in the Middle Ages, but fires often caused great destruction. Although it was spared by fires, the cathedral was nevertheless destroyed and rebuilt, and the work took nearly a century. All around the Place des Lys, there's the famous market whose origins go back to the end of the Middle Ages. The stalls bring in crowds once a week.
It's an exceptional market, considered to be the second biggest in France, because there are 300 local farmers coming in every Saturday to sell their fresh produce.
It's all garden produce. That's why we do just seasonal products. When you consider tomatoes today, we're the only ones growing tomatoes in soil. They're in greenhouses, but growing in soil, not soilless like everything else you see. So we get horse manure to plant it in, and we insist on that. It's very, very important.
This is part of Rennes' DNA, this Lys market. Firstly, because it's a quite extraordinary historical site. Here you see private residences with wooden framing built for members of parliament, but also 2 market pavilions. Its metal architecture was designed in the style of Baltard, like the Parisian market halls of the 19th century. They're very distinctive, and there are listed buildings here.
Produce from the sea occupies prime position among the fresh foods. Some of them are particularly noteworthy, like the spider crab.
Do you need anything else?
The terrible fire of 1720 destroyed nearly half of the town. There was considerable damage because the houses were close together. After the catastrophe, the town was rebuilt little by little in a great variety of styles. For example, the Hôtel de Blossac is a masterpiece of classical architecture. Happily, not everything was burned down. the Brittany Parliament was saved, but another fire destroyed its roof in 1994. A real breathing space for the town is provided by Tabor Park, which combines several gardens, and notably a symmetrical garden in the French style. An aviary in the shape of a Chinese pagoda houses numerous birds, in particular some exotic species. An English garden alternates topiary bushes and wide spaces bordered by trees. English gardens always imitate nature in the wild. The town merges several different eras. In a recent work, granite columns remind us of lines of standing stones. They are placed in front of the building housing the Regional Contemporary Arts Fund. The French architect Christian de Porzampar uses unworked stone to open up the great volumes of champs libres or open fields. A vast cultural complex which brings together a museum, a planetarium, and a library. The town of Rennes has an ultra-modern underground system and a public transport network with many branches. And bicycles are more and more popular. Near the town, Beaulieu campus was built in the 1960s. Various disciplines are taught on a site that owes much of its inspiration to Californian university campuses. To the west of Rennes lies the biggest forest of Brittany, Paimpont Forest, which for many years was overexploited. Man's presence in this forest dates from way back, and some elements of Paimpont Abbey date from the 7th century. Across the region, there are many historical references. References to literature and legend are also numerous in an environment where reality blends with myth. Imaginary characters such as Merlin the magician have ruled over a magical world since the Middle Ages. They live in an imaginary forest, the Brocéliande woods. The sturdy Josselin Castle is also immersed in legend. In order to hold out against German invaders, a Breton lord organized its defense. It was the celebrated King Arthur.
There are several myths and legends in the Brocéliande woods. There are local stories about the actual woods, but above all, we have the Arthurian legend. Now, for the Arthurian legend, we have to go back to the 9th century to see the beginning of certain things. It was an oral tradition at the time, so it was handed down by word of mouth. And it wasn't until the 12th century, with a certain Chrétien de Troyes, for example, that the first medieval writings on the Arthurian legend appeared.
In the forest of Paimpont, we find living witnesses to a distant past. The Guillotin oak is one of the best known. The tree, which has a hollow trunk, is said to be 1,000 years old, and rumor has it that it hid the abbot Guillotin when he was being pursued by revolutionaries. This old oak really commands our respect.
You feel so humbled.
It makes me think of all the history that it has seen happen at its foot. The revolution, the empires, and also it's a Brittany oak, so it has Celtic origins too.
During the Fest Noz, the night festival, they celebrate Breton traditions with dances and songs. At the frontier between the departments of Côte d'Armor and Morbihan, the landscape has been turned upside down by the hand of man. The artificial Guillotin lake is the largest in Brittany. It owes its existence to a dam and a small canal that runs between Nantes and Brest. The canal was dug by convicts who were housed in the Notre-Dame de Bon Repos Abbey. The venerable Cistercian abbey was created in the 12th century and then slowly declined. It was sacked and then abandoned for a long period before being partly restored. In the 16th century, the Vilaine River was the first one to be canalized in France. The river was thus improved to become a very peaceful watercourse that remains undisturbed today. The locality of Brain-sur-Vilaine celebrates with pomp and ceremony one of its most illustrious inhabitants of the Merovingian era. Saint Melen, born in the 5th century, is a true local boy. He was Bishop of Rennes, and his relics are carried through the streets of the locality for the pardon, a sort of Breton pilgrimage. Several miracles are attributed to Saint Melen, who roamed the countryside to spread the word. But Saint Melen was not just a cleric. He also played an important political role for Clovis himself, the king of the Franks. Saint Melen was buried on a hill known as Field of Repose. In his village, he had gathered together his first disciples. He even built a church with his own hands. This later became an abbey. The population pays heartfelt homage to Saint Melen. The megalithic site of Saint-Just, dating from 5,000 years BC, is one of the most important sites in Europe in terms of the number and the variety of standing stones found there.
When they were found, all the standing stones had fallen down. During the excavation, the archaeologists found the holes where the stones were placed. And from there, they were able to reconstitute all this alignment. Here, men and people were buried. So it is really a burial ground. And to think that men moved these great blocks of stone to make a monument is an enormous thing, because we have difficulty imagining just how they transported them.
The idea of creating a canal from Nantes to Brest goes back to the 16th century, when the Duchy of Brittany and the Kingdom of France were united. Road communications were poor. However, it wasn't until 3 centuries later, when the British blockade occurred, that the canal works were started by Napoleon. On the banks of the Oust, the little town of Josselin nestles at the foot of an impressive castle. The village carries the name of one of the first members of a powerful noble family of Brittany, which was strongly implicated in the history of France. Right at the beginning of the 11th century, a castle already dominated the valley. Today's building belongs to the Rohan family. Both imposing and stylish, it has a remarkable facade in the pure flamboyant Gothic style. The use of the building has evolved.
Originally, the castle was used only as a military stronghold. It was a fortress. Actually, it was built on the model of the royal castle of Vincennes, and it was one of the strongest fortresses in Brittany. It was also one of the strongest in France. But at the beginning of the 16th century, Viscount Jean II of Rohan, the uncle of the Queen of Brittany, stuck onto this old fortress, a dwelling that he had beautifully decorated with great taste. As you can see, this facade, exceptionally rich and luxurious, is an example of flamboyant Gothic, as well as giving witness to the Brittany Renaissance.
The long and ancient farming tradition has profoundly influenced Brittany's culture. The rural lifestyle modeled not only the landscape, but also human behavior. So group dances served for many years to bring together the community. Dancing is a factor in social bonding.
It's a Breton dance. People come together to dance in a circle. It's not like a nightclub where everyone dances in his own corner. Everybody links arms and off goes the dance.
Group dancing was recommended by the Catholic Church, which forbade dancing in couples. The Canal of Rennes was also laid out by Napoleon following the naval blockade by the English. The idea of linking the towns of Rennes and Saint-Malo was a very old one. At the halfway point between the two towns stands the castle of Tabor. The castle was sold in the 18th century to a sailor who'd made his fortune because the aristocratic family that had owned it up until then had fallen upon hard times. One of the sons of the new owner was to become famous, François-René de Chateaubriand. The department of Finistere is the westernmost one of Brittany. The west coast is washed by the Atlantic along a very jagged shoreline. The Pointe du Vent points its crumbly rocks into the ocean waves. Since the 17th century, there has been on the edge of the plain between the Pointe du Vent and the Baie des Trépassés a chapel. A bell used to warn boats that they were approaching an inhospitable coastline. Nevertheless, the coast offers a welcome to sailors in the shelter of the Bay of Douarnenez. The town based its prosperity on fishing, but today yachting has taken over. Douarnenez boasts 3 ports, each one adapted to different types of boats and their activities. Sailcloth was at the origin of the wealth of Locronan, which experienced a great economical surge from the 14th century onwards thanks to the skill of its weavers. The sailcloth merchants' houses form an exceptional heritage. The Saint-Ronan church was built in the 15th century. The ostentatious building tells of the rise, the peak, and the sudden decline of sailcloth in Locronan. Activity began to fall off with the invention of the mechanical weaving loom. The Armorican Massif is Brittany's bedrock. Despite the erosion of the ages, there are still peaks where the wind favors the acrobatics of remote-controlled aeroplanes. From the foot of the hill, the Crozon Peninsula thrusts Toulinguet Point into the Iroise Sea. The Crozon Peninsula has become Brittany's 8th regional nature reserve. It consists of several sites on land and sea. For the most part, they're cliffs made up of unusual rocks and minerals. Brittany's entire geological history is seen here beneath the open sky. The monument to the Bretons of Free France was built here at Prettier Point. At Douarnenez Bay, the cliffs give way to a peaceful cove, wherein the port of Morlaix nestles. Further north at Camaret-sur-Mer, in the chapel of Notre-Dame de Rocamadour, sailors' ex-votos hang from the vault, which is in the shape of the hull of an upturned boat. Since the 17th century, the Vauban Tower has watched over the entrance to the port. Finistere's sub-prefecture, Brest, is Brittany's second biggest conurbation. Because of its remote position, the old saying goes, you don't go through Brest, you have to have a reason for going there. It has to be said, there's no shortage of reasons to do so. Activities related to the port are the town's principal economic asset. Brest is France's second biggest military port after Toulon. The Tanguy Tower and the fortified Brest Castle were built in the Middle Ages. Their deterrent effect was necessary in order to protect the vast harbour where large fleets could find a natural safe haven. For centuries, ships from all over the world came to moor in Brittany. Brest's anchorage welcomes both civilian and military vessels. Sailors from everywhere meet here amid a non-stop hustle and bustle. Many training ships use the port of Brest, like the Sedov, the Russian Navy's four-master, which is the world's biggest training ship. Sea shanties, inspired by the seafaring life, are all oddly similar, whichever corner of the world they originate from. During the four-yearly festival of the Tonnerre de Brest, traditional vessels come from all over the world. The entrance to Brest Harbour was carefully guarded. On an islet linked to the mainland by a footbridge, Vauban built Berthaume Fort during the 17th century. One can also get to the mainland via a zip wire. Before the footbridge was built, this was the only way to reach the island. Excitement guaranteed. Pointe Saint-Mathieu, St. Matthew's Point, is home to a remarkable collection of buildings. The chapel makes up a curious ensemble along with its noteworthy neighbors. A lighthouse and a semaphore huddle around the ruins of a medieval abbey. Time never stands still in Brittany. Brittany's shores have always been in the front line against any potential invaders. As a result, a succession of defensive structures lines the coast. It was Vauban again, the famous architectural engineer to the court of Louis XIV, who designed the Château du Taureau in the 17th century. It replaced an older, outmoded structure. Its walls had to be able to withstand not only cannonballs, but also the onslaughts of the sea itself. The sections reserved for the garrison's quarters were well protected. The Château du Taureau was in fact built to erase a painful memory.
The castle where we now stand was built to defend the town of Morlaix, which was attacked by our English friends in 1522. Approximately 60 ships came down the river here, and they disguised themselves as merchant ships to attack the town.
With its tobacco factory, one of the oldest in France, Morlaix was built in a valley between two very steep slopes. A viaduct was built to link one side to the other. It became the target of an intensive bombing campaign in the Second World War. Thanks to this protection, the town of Morlaix quickly thrived. Rich merchants had distinctive timbered houses built, pont d'allée houses. To reach the upper floors, there was a spiral staircase and a kind of wooden walkway led to the rear. The pont d'allée, or the alley bridge. Some houses in Morlaix still have this feature. In the south of Morlaix, a number of churches are surrounded by carved parish walls which encircle the monuments and sculptures. Villages like Saint-Brieuc competed with their neighbors to have the finest architecture. The parish wall all around the church was designed to instruct the faithful, but also became outward signs of wealth. The color of the rocks on the pink granite coast is due to the presence of iron oxide. The hard rock can resist erosion while assuming these rounded shapes. There are very few pink granite coasts in the world. Plougrescant is Brittany's most northerly district. Erosion can be a concern when it causes unstable rock piles near housing. But erosion can also be a comfort, like here at Castelmeur, where it has carved out a protective rock face. Man and his environment living in perfect harmony. One of Brittany's northern departments used to be known as Côte du Nord, northern coast. It is now called Côte d'Armor, meaning sea country coast. Nowadays principally used by yachts, the port of Paimpol was for centuries renowned for its fishing. Cod fishing made the town wealthy. In a display of this affluence, most of its houses were built of stone. Fishermen would go on journeys lasting several months to cast their nets in the waters of Newfoundland, even reaching the shores of America. North of Arquest Point lie the scattered islands of the Brehat archipelago. A boat service links these islands to the mainland. The trip only takes 10 minutes. Brehat Island is the biggest of them. It is in fact made up of two conjoined islands, the North Island and the South Island. Its total surface area is barely 3 square kilometers. It's not uncommon to find tropical plants on the archipelago. The South Island has a very mild climate and is sheltered from the wind and the briny sea spray. Walls and hedges provide further protection for the flora. Brehat's hills are really very symbolic. The island's highest point is the Crec Simon. Crec is the Breton word for hill. This one rises to a height of 35 meters. The archipelago looks quite different at high and low tide. The tidal mill at Morlaix has been powered by seawater since the 17th century. The North Island is far more exposed to the open sea. Pines and moors struggle to gain a foothold here as the wind and the waves lay bare the rocks. The marina at Brittany is only accessible at high tide. Every year in late May and early June, the cod festival is the cause of great excitement. The fish has contributed greatly to the town's reputation. In Saint-Brieuc Bay, dozens of traditional boats gather to pay tribute to past times. The sailors demonstrate their way of life and build up quite a following. For a while, they can leave technology behind and go back to their roots, and their passion is infectious. Meanwhile, back on terra firma, the festival is in full swing for sailors and landlubbers alike. But the real stars of the show are the boats.
These wooden boats are part of our heritage and are close to our hearts. So we prefer to sail them and keep them alive because they are very delicate boats needing a lot of maintenance. Because if we don't look after them, they'll disappear, and there won't be any more festivals like this one.
The festival keeps tradition alive for all generations. A famous paragliding spot, Roselier Point, offers spectacular views of the Bay of Saint-Brieuc. The sandy beach seems to go on forever. In fact, at low tide, the water's edge is 7 kilometers away. Saint-Brieuc port reaches right into the town. These half-timbered houses are evidence of the tastes and the way of life of their builders. Plestin-les-Grèves beach along one of Brittany's biggest bays is ideal for sail karting. Saint-Brieuc Bay is shut off to the east by Cap Frehel. Its pink sandstone reaches far out into the sea. The sea-facing cliff faces are covered with the gentle colors of vegetation such as heather. From the tops of the cliffs, lighthouses guide the ships. In stormy weather, navigating between the bays of Saint-Brieuc and Saint-Malo is a delicate operation. A bird sanctuary has been established around Cap Frehel, and many seabirds come to seek refuge. Cap Frehel marks the beginning of the Emerald Coast, which stretches eastwards. The coastline is interrupted by the Rennes estuary, which reaches over 20 kilometers inland. A tidal power plant built across the river provides electricity. It harnesses tidal power from both rising and ebb tides. For such an installation to be viable, there has to be a marked difference in the water level between high and low tides. The plant also serves as a road bridge linking the two riverbanks. Between rivers and sea, the agricultural landscape is portioned out in geometrical plots, evidence of an age-old harmony. The sea keeps its distance, but it's always there, like here at Mont Saint-Michel. Back in the early Middle Ages, Dol de Bretagne was founded. It's one of the region's first bishoprics. Popular traditions are deeply rooted here, as demonstrated by the Fest Noz. Between Normandy and northern Brittany, the lower town of Dinan nestles on the banks of the gently flowing Rennes River. A bridge was built to cross the little river, which soon made the town strategically important. From the Middle Ages, Dinan protected itself by means of ramparts, which over time were restored and modernized. The town made its defenses even stronger by building a huge keep to protect its inhabitants. This part of Brittany, envied by many, was under the protection of the fearsome Bertrand du Guesclin, one of Dinan's famous historical figures. Despite suffering severe damage during World War II, the town's heritage is still preserved in its several dozen historical buildings. All along the Emerald Coast, oyster beds seem to be afloat. These highly prized mollusks are farmed to compensate for the dwindling supply of wild oysters. A variety of techniques is used to produce a number of species, which differ both in appearance and flavor. In Canal, oysters are a vital part of ancient tradition. Even in the 16th century, the town supplied the court of the King of France. Successive generations of Canal oyster farmers have produced both flat and cupped oysters. Evidently, both are delicious.
It's the first time I've ever eaten one. They're really nice. Perfect.
Still on the Emerald Coast, on the left bank of the Rennes, sits the town of Dinard. For many years, it was a modest fishing village. Then, in the 19th century, wealthy aristocrats and rich industrialists from Britain and the US turned it into a seaside resort. Dinard therefore became chic and trendy. The town still has the faded glamour of its glory years, when sea bathing was all the rage. Since the 14th century, the mouth of the Rennes has been watched over by the Solidor Tower, a keep actually made up of 3 towers. Walls dotted with arrow slits and machicolations made assailants think twice before attacking. On the river's right bank, the city of Saint-Malo is equally well protected behind its great walls. The town's first fortifications were already in existence in the 12th century, but the majority of the current walls were actually built in the 18th century by a colleague of Vauban. The city was severely damaged during World War II. It was not rebuilt as an exact replica, but it still stayed within the confines of the city walls. The discovery of America and trade with the Indian subcontinent ensured Saint-Malo's prosperity. Many legendary seamen came from this city, including privateers, who put themselves in the service of the king and enhanced Saint-Malo's reputation. Behind the ramparts, the privateers amassed vast fortunes and invested their ill-gotten gains in magnificent mansions. Olivier de la Rivière is the descendant of a genuine Saint-Malo privateer.
This house was built in 1725 for one of the town's ship owners. And 300 years ago, a ship owner would have been one of the king's privateers. This meant that they would take their ships to fight a war against another country sanctioned by the king. As private operators, they would sail into battle in ships they actually owned. If you were one of the king's privateers, you had to have an immediate knowledge of what countries were at war with your own. And secondly, you could attack them and only them. Were you to attack without written authorization from the king, you would be considered a pirate, and you would be hanged.
One section of the city's medieval walls forms part of the Saint-Malo Castle. The fortress houses the town hall and was built by the Dukes of Brittany as a symbol of their power. It's also home to the Museum of the History of the city and the region of Saint-Malo, which contains 500 years of French maritime history. Among the treasures on display is a portrait of the famous privateer Robert Surcouf, the swashbuckling sailor who became an extremely wealthy man. Everything here is a reminder of the science of seafaring, but also of the brutality and mercilessness of a world one had to conquer in order to survive. The defense of Saint-Malo was meticulously planned. On the rock of the islet, Louis XIV himself designed the construction of the national fort. The bastion prevented the town from ever falling into enemy hands. The sharp angles of the walls made them highly efficient. Then the town of Saint-Malo turned its gaze outwards and eventually threw its doors wide open. Brittany's long history is inseparable from its relationship with the sea, which is deeply ingrained in the region's identity and culture. Brittany's heritage today still holds a true wealth of traditions.